The kitchen smelled of cold ash and someone else's soap. My wedding dress still held the stiffness of the day, and my hands did not know where to rest. On the table sat 3 plates, though only 2 of us stood in that house. My husband, a man whose voice I had heard for the first time that afternoon, did not sit. He looked at the door, then at me, and asked the only thing that seemed to matter to him. Not my name, not whether I was tired. He asked where they had sent Aneka, my sister, and I realized I had married a stranger who already knew mine. I am Miriam, and I grew up in a plain community where a woman's worth was often measured by how quietly she could carry other people's arrangements. I tell these stories now because so many of them were meant to stay unspoken, and silence has a way of outliving the people it protects. If stories about hidden family bargains and the women asked to hold them together stay with you, it helps me to know you are listening, so consider subscribing before we go on. And I want to ask you something specific, not general. When did you first sense you had been chosen for a task, not for yourself? Hold that. Now let me take you back to that kitchen. I was 19, and I had never been alone with a man before that evening. The farmhouse belonged to his family, set at the far edge of a District 2 valleys from my own. The floorboards were newer than ours, the windows narrower, and the whole place had the tidy strangeness of a home kept by someone I did not know. I remember thinking that I should say something wifely, something warm, and that I had no idea what such a thing would sound like. My mother had told me only to be agreeable. She had not told me that agreeableness has no words prepared for a husband who wants news of your sister before he wants supper. He was tall and older than me by perhaps 8 years, with a beard just beginning and hands scarred from harness work. His name was Amos. That much I had been given, along with the fact that he was steady and that his family was respected, which in our world was said the way other people say a man is kind. When he asked about Annika, his voice was low and careful, as if the question itself were something breakable. I answered without thinking, the way you answer a school teacher. I said she had gone to our mother's cousins far north to help with a new baby. It was the story I had been given too. Something in his face loosened and tightened at the same time. Relief that she was somewhere, worry that it was there. He nodded slowly and finally pulled out a chair, but he did not eat much, and neither did I. The 3rd plate stayed empty between us like a person who had stepped out and would be back any moment. I did not ask about it. On my wedding night, I was learning a lesson I would spend months relearning, which is that in that house the questions belonged to other people, and my job was to have answers ready when they came for them. You have to understand how a marriage like mine even happens, because from the outside it looks impossible. In the district where I was raised, courting was quiet but real. A young man drove a girl home from a singing. There were months of it, small and sweet, before anything was settled. That was not my marriage. My father and Amos's father settled the whole thing in less than a season, over the course of a few visits I was not part of. I was told, not asked. I was measured for a dress and given a date. I met my husband's eyes for the first time across the room where we were joined. I did not fight it, and I want to be honest about that. Fighting it never occurred to me as something a person in my position could do. I was the 2nd daughter, the reliable one, the one who did not need watching. My older sister Annika was the bright and difficult one, the one our mother sighed about, and I had built my whole small identity on being her opposite. So when my parents told me a good family wanted a steady girl, I understood it as praise. I understood it as being seen. I did not yet understand that being called steady can be another word for being called useful. The strangeness of that first night did not leave in the morning. Amos rose before light, gentle enough, and told me the layout of the house and where things were kept, and among the things he showed me was a wooden writing box on a high shelf. He said it was his and that I should leave it be. He said it plainly, without threat, the way you would mention a hot stove to a child. but I noticed he glanced at it more than once while he spoke, the way you check on something you are afraid of. A locked box in a house of 2 people is not a small thing. It is a room you are not allowed into. I have gone over that first day many times in the years since, turning it the way you turn a coin to catch the light. At the time, I told myself that every marriage begins as a house full of a stranger's habits, and that mine would fill with meaning the way any house does. That was true, in its way, but I was reading the wrong story. I thought I was at the beginning of my own life. I was actually standing in the middle of someone else's, in a chapter that had been written before I arrived, with my name penciled in where another name had been. What I did not know, sitting at that table with its 3 plates and its one careful question, was that my husband had not been surprised by me at all. He had been braced for me. Somewhere in the days before our wedding, someone had told him who I was and what I was for, and he had agreed to it the way I had agreed to everything, by not knowing enough to refuse. His first question about Aneka was not idle, and it was not cruel. It was the only true thing anyone said in that house for a long time, and it would take me most of a year to learn what he had really been asking. The house settled into a rhythm quickly, the way a body settles into cold water once it stops fighting. I learned where the flour was kept and which floorboard announced anyone coming down the stairs. I learned that Amos was a quiet man who worked hard and spoke little, and that his silences had textures I began to read. There was a working silence and a thinking silence and a third kind that came only when Aneka's name might have come up, a silence like a hand pressed over a mouth. I did not have a name for it then. I only knew that certain rooms in our conversation had the doors shut and that I was not the one who had shut them. For the first weeks, I was almost happy, and I say almost because the happiness had a false floor. He thanked me for meals. He fixed a draft in the window over the wash basin without my asking. To a girl raised to expect little, small courtesies felt like a whole climate. I let myself believe that this was the meaning I had been waiting for the house to fill with. I wrote to my mother that I was well. I did not write to Annika, though I wanted to, because I did not yet know that not writing to her was already the first rule I was obeying without being told. You should understand what a marriage like mine rested on, practically. I had come with a small chest of clothes and quilts and nothing else. No money of my own, no means to travel the 2 valleys home, except to ask a man to hitch a horse and drive me, and every such man belonged to one family or the other. If I wanted to leave a room, I could. If I wanted to leave that life, there was no door I could reach on my own feet. Dependence is not always cruelty. Sometimes it is just the shape of the ground you are standing on, and you only notice it when you try to move. To the neighbors, ours was a good match, and they said so. An older woman named Fanny, who lived down the lane, told me I was fortunate, that the family was solid, that Amos had waited a long time to marry. That last part caught in me like a splinter. A long time. He was nearly 27. In our world, a man of steady means did not simply forget to marry for years. Something had kept him. Someone, maybe. But Fanny said it lightly, the way you mention weather, and moved on to ask about my sewing, and I let the splinter stay in and worked around it, the way you do. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to make it sound like everyone in that district lived under the same iron rule, and that is not true, and I will not say it. Most families courted honestly. Most marriages were made the ordinary way. What happened to me was not a custom of a people. It was an arrangement between 2 particular families, in one particular valley, dressed up in the ordinary clothes of our life, so that it would pass without comment. The most dangerous rules are the ones that look exactly like the normal ones. That is how they hide in plain sight, at the family table, in a locked box, in a name no one says. The first real sign came from an old letter, not one of mine. I was cleaning out a drawer in the front room and found a bundle of my new family's papers, church notices and seed receipts and such, and among them a card with my sister's name on the envelope in my mother's hand. It had been sent to this house, to Amos's family, weeks before I was ever spoken of as a bride. My mouth went dry looking at it. Annika had been written to here, at the home of a man she had supposedly never met, in the home I now lived in as a wife. I put the bundle back exactly as I found it, my hands not quite steady. I did not confront anyone. I want you to understand how far I was, then, from being the kind of woman who confronts. Instead, I did what women in my place had always done, which is to become watchful. I began to notice which drawers were kept in what order. I noticed that Amos's mother, though she lived elsewhere, wrote to him often, and that he read her letters standing at the window and did not leave them lying about. I noticed the third plate, still set at supper more nights than not, out of a habit no one explained. A house speaks, if you are quiet enough to let it, and mine had begun to tell me that I had walked into the middle of something. That was the winter I stopped being only a bride and started being a watcher in my own home, and I have thought many times since about how many women learn that particular skill. Not because they are suspicious by nature, because the people around them have made honesty too expensive. If you have ever lived in a house where the truth was kept on a high shelf, in a box that was not yours to open, then you already know the strange loneliness of loving people you cannot fully trust. I did not go looking for the truth that winter. I only started keeping my eyes open. But once your eyes are open, you cannot make yourself unsee. It was a small thing that finally made me ask. A letter came for me from my mother, and in it she mentioned, only in passing, that they had not heard from Annika in some time and hoped she was writing to me. I read that line 3 times. My sister, who had filled my childhood with words, who could not keep a thought inside her for an afternoon, had gone quiet even to our own mother, and she was supposedly caring for a baby, a day's travel from anyone who knew her. That night, with the lamp low and Amos mending a strap by the stove, I asked him plainly whether he knew how I might write to her. He did not look up from his work at first. His hands kept moving, the awl, the thread, the steady pull. Then they stopped. He set the strap on his knee and looked at me with an expression I had not seen on him before, something between apology and warning. He said it would be better if I did not write to Annika for now. Not never, he said, for now. And when I asked why, he did not give me a reason. He only repeated it, more slowly, as though the slowness were itself the explanation. It would be better, for now, as if those words were a fence, and I could see there was a field beyond it, but not enter. I asked who had decided that. It was a bolder question than I had ever put to him, and it surprised us both. Amos looked toward the shelf where the writing box sat, only for a second, but I caught it, the way you catch a person's eyes going to the thing they are protecting. He said it was best for everyone, and that I should trust that he was not trying to hurt me. I believed the second part. That was the trouble. He was gentle, and his gentleness made the rule feel less like a cage and more like a kindness, which is exactly what made it so hard to fight. I said something then that I had not planned to say. I said that I had married a man I had never spoken to, and that on our first night his first question had been about my sister and not about me, and that I had gone along with all of it, but that I would like, just once, to be told the truth by someone. My voice did not rise. In our house voices did not rise, but the words hung in the room with a weight I could feel. Amos looked at me for a long moment, and I saw him decide against speaking, and the deciding was worse than any answer he could have given. He stood, put the strap away, and told me he was tired. As he passed the shelf, he did something small. He reached up and turned the writing box so its keyhole faced the wall, away from me. It was such a little movement, but it told me everything the words had refused to. Whatever answer I wanted was in that box, and he would rather turn its face from me than let me near it. I lay awake that night with the shape of the box in my mind, its keyhole like a shut-eye, and I understood that I had married a locked thing as much as I had married a man. The next morning something had changed, though nothing was said. Amos left earlier than usual and stayed out longer. When his mother's letter came that week, he read it, and then, instead of tucking it away, he burned it in the stove, watching until the last corner curled black. He had never done that before, not in front of me. I realized my question the night before had traveled somewhere. I had spoken quietly to my husband in our own kitchen, and somehow, by some thread I could not see, my asking had reached other hands. The house was not just watching me, it was reporting me. I began to understand that the rule about Anarchy was not Amos's rule. He was enforcing it, but he was not its author. A man does not turn a box to the wall and burn his mother's letters over something he himself invented. He does those things when he is caught between what he has been told to protect and what he cannot bring himself to fully do. I had thought my husband was the wall between me and my sister. I was starting to see that he might be standing against that wall too, on the same side as me, only afraid to say so. That possibility frightened me more than a simple cruel husband would have, because if Amos was afraid, then whoever he was afraid of was still above us both, out of sight, deciding things in rooms I would never be invited into. I did not know yet whose hands my question had reached, or how quickly. I only knew that a fence had gone up between me and one honest answer, and that fences in our world were never built by one person alone. They were agreed upon, and within a few days I would learn just how many people had already agreed, long before I ever set foot in that cold kitchen and looked at 3 plates set for 2. She arrived on a Tuesday, without warning, in a hired driver's car that she paid off at the end of the lane so as not to be seen riding up in it. Amos's mother, Barbara, was a small, straight-backed woman with a face that had decided things long ago and did not intend to reconsider. She said she had come to help me settle the house, since a young wife could not be expected to know a family's ways. She unpacked a single bag into the spare room and did not name a day for leaving. I welcomed her the way I had been raised to welcome anyone. I set a 4th plate. She looked at the 3rd one, already there, and said nothing. At first I truly believed her. Older women came to help younger ones all the time. It was ordinary, even kind. Barbara showed me how the family liked their bread, which linens were for church Sundays, how Amos took his coffee. She was not warm, but she was not cruel either, and I told myself I had been foolish and lonely and had imagined a conspiracy where there was only an ordinary quiet family. For about a week, I let that comfort hold me. It is easier, I have found, to believe you are imagining things than to believe the people feeding you have a reason to watch you eat. The mail was what gave her away. It had always come to the house and sat on the front table until Amos or I took it up. Now it came to Barbara's hand first. She would gather it from the box at the lane's end on her morning walk, and by the time it reached the table, anything addressed to me had already passed through her fingers. One afternoon I saw her hold a letter of mine to the window light before setting it down, reading the shape of the folded page through the paper. She did it without shame, the way you check bread for doneness. My letters were not private. They were an errand she performed. Old Fanny down the lane saw it too, in her way. She stopped me by the fence one gray morning and made small talk, and then, apropos of nothing, she said a thing I have never forgotten. She said that in her long life she had watched daughters get sent away for 2 different reasons. Some were sent for their own good, she said, and some were sent for the family's good, and the hardest thing was that from the outside the 2 looked exactly the same. Then she asked how my sister was liking the North, and watched my face while I answered, and I understood she was not asking. She was telling me she knew there was something to know. Not long after, my letters stopped arriving anywhere at all. I gave a sealed letter to my mother, to Amos, to post in town, and weeks later my mother wrote asking why I had gone silent. I had not gone silent. I had been silenced, gently, by hands passing my words from one to another until they simply stopped moving. I mentioned it to Barbara, carefully, as a worry about the post. She said the roads had been bad. The roads had not been bad. She said it the way she did everything, smoothly, and I saw then that lying came to her without effort, the way breathing does, because she did not think of it as lying. She thought of it as keeping order. I started to notice how the family behaved around Annika's name, now that I was watching for it. At a shared Sunday meal with cousins, I mentioned my sister once, only to say I missed her, and the table did a thing I can only describe as flinching without moving. A cousin's wife changed the subject to preserves. An uncle asked Amos about a fence line. It was seamless, practiced, the turning away of people who had all been told the same thing and trusted one another to keep turning. I was the only one at that table who did not know the steps to the dance, and my not knowing was, I now think, the entire reason I had been brought in. That was the night the real doubt arrived, cold and clear. I had been telling myself I was a wife in a new family learning its ways. Now I let myself think the other thought all the way through. I had not been married to make a home. I had been married to solve a problem. Annika was the problem, and I was some part of the solution, though I could not yet see how a quiet second daughter 2 valleys away could solve anything. But the shape of it was there, the way you feel a room is not empty before your eyes adjust. I was useful to these people. I just did not know for what. I decided I would stop asking Amos, who would only turn boxes to the wall, and go instead to the person who seemed to hold the answers in her small, straight hands. I would ask Barbara directly what had happened to my sister and why my marriage and her leaving seemed to be one event wearing 2 faces. I chose a Sunday afternoon, thinking the quiet of it would make honesty easier. I did not understand yet that in this family a direct question was not a door you knocked on, it was an alarm you tripped. And by asking it of Barbara, I would bring down on myself the full weight of people I had never met. I never got to ask Barbara alone. I had meant to, on that quiet Sunday, but when I came down after the morning's work, I found the front room already arranged. 2 extra chairs had been carried in. Amos's father, a heavy, silent man named Amos, had come, and beside him sat my own father, who had traveled the 2 valleys without a word to me. I had not seen my father since my wedding. My first feeling was joy, quick and childish, before I understood the arrangement of the room. The men sat together in a half circle. Barbara sat near them. 1 chair was left across from all of them, and it was meant for me. They did not call it a meeting. No one names these things. It was Sunday visiting, a family gathered, and yet the doors to the kitchen and the hall were both shut, which no one does when there is nothing to keep in a room. My father greeted me kindly and asked about my health, and there was real warmth in it, which is what made the rest so hard. These were not monsters. That is the thing I most need you to hear. They were people who loved order more than they loved the truth, and who had convinced themselves the 2 were the same, and who could be tender to me in the very hour they were closing a door on me. My father began. He said he had heard I was troubled, restless, not yet settled into married life, and that this was natural in a young wife but should not be allowed to grow. That word, restless, landed on me strangely. I had not been restless. I had been asking about my sister. But there in that circle my questions had been gathered up, carried across 2 valleys, and handed back to me wearing a new name. I was not a woman asking where her sister was. I was a girl who had not yet settled. My concern had been renamed into a flaw in me, and everyone in the room nodded as though the renaming were simply a fact. I said, as steadily as I could, that I only wished to write to Annika and to know she was well. Amos spoke for the first time. His voice was low and final, a voice used to ending conversations. He said Annika was well and cared for, and that dwelling on her would help no one, least of all her. He said it was time I understood that my place was here now, in this house, with this family, and that a good wife did not go digging in matters her husband had already closed. Amos, beside me, said nothing at all. He looked at his own hands. I have never felt so married to a man and so alone with him at the same time. Barbara added the softest words, which were the sharpest. She said they all cared for me deeply and wanted only my peace, and that peace came from letting go of what could not be changed. It sounded like comfort. It was a leash. What they offered me, I understood, was protection and belonging, on the single condition that I stop wanting the one thing I had asked for. Help was promised, only supervision was given. The care was real, and the cage was real, and they were the same object, held out to me in my father's kind, tired hands, and I did not know how to take one without taking the other. Then my father said a thing that told me more than he meant to. He said the family had been through enough trouble with one daughter and did not need to begin again with another. One daughter, he caught himself an instant too late, and I saw Barbara's eyes flick to him. But it was said, and Neki was the first daughter he meant. There had been trouble, real trouble large enough that a marriage had been built to bury it, and I had just been warned, in front of everyone, not to become the second thing they had to manage. I understood then that I was not being asked to settle, I was being asked to disappear quietly. I gave them what they wanted to see. I lowered my eyes and said I understood, and I did understand, only not in the way they thought. They believed they had settled me. In truth, they had confirmed everything. My marriage and Annike's leaving had been decided in one conversation, by these same people, in some room exactly like this one. I had not been chosen for love or even for convenience. I had been chosen because I was the daughter least likely to trip the alarm, and now that I had tripped it, they were teaching me the cost. The meeting ended with prayer. I bowed my head and did not hear a word of it. That evening, after my father had gone and the extra chairs were carried back out, Amos went to bed early, and Barbara sat mending by the stove as though nothing had happened. I climbed the stairs, and passing the shelf in the near dark, I stopped. The writing box was there, and in the quiet after that room, after that word one, and my father's face when it escaped him, I understood that whatever the box held was not Amos's secret alone. It belonged to all of them. I stood a long moment in the dark, with my hand not quite touching the lid, and I made a decision I could not yet act on. Sooner or later, I was going to open it. The chance to learn more came not from the box, but from a woman I had barely noticed. Her name was Sabina, a widow related to Amos's family by a marriage long dissolved by death, and she came now and then to help with heavy seasonal work in exchange for a share of what she helped put up. She was near 60, broad-handed, with a way of speaking that landed flat and plain, without the careful softness everyone else in that family used like a second skin. That autumn she came to help me put up the walnuts, and we sat together on the back step for a whole gray afternoon, cracking shells into a bucket between our feet. For a long while we only worked. There is a rhythm to that kind of labor, the crack and pick and toss, that loosens tongues without either person deciding to talk. Sabina asked me ordinary things, how I was keeping, whether the house suited me. Then, without changing her tone at all, she asked whether anyone had told me the truth about why Annike went north. She asked it the way she might ask whether I wanted salt. I said no one had told me anything true about my sister since the day I arrived. Sabina nodded slowly, cracked a shell, and said that was the family's whole method, and always had been. She had reason to hesitate, and I could see her weighing it. She still lived on a strip of land that belonged, through a tangle of old agreements, to the same two families that had made my marriage. To speak against them was to risk the roof over her own head. But she was old and widowed and had less left to lose than most, and I think she had carried something a long time and was tired of carrying it. She told me she had been there, years before, when the two fathers first sat down together. Not for my marriage, for something earlier, something Anneke had seen and had refused to keep quiet about. She would not tell me the whole of it that day, and I understood not to push. But she told me this. She had once had a daughter of her own, a bright girl, and that girl had been moved away too, quietly, under an arrangement dressed up as a kindness, and had come back years later a stranger who no longer wrote. Sabina said the word arrangement the way you would say the name of an illness that had taken someone. She was not warning me in general terms. She was telling me she had already watched this exact thing happen to a girl she loved, and that she recognized the shape of it settling now over me. Then she did something I did not expect. She reached into her apron and took out a folded square of cloth, old and worn soft, and pressed it into my hand. It was half of something once whole, torn along a seam, its edges frayed, but the stitching along the good side still bright. A pattern of small cross threads, the kind a child learns first. I knew it at once, though I had not seen it in years. Anneke and I had made a sampler together as girls, one on each side, and had cut it down the middle so we could each keep the other's half. This was Anneke's half. Not mine, hers. I asked Sabina where she had gotten it, and my voice did not sound like my own. She said she had not gotten it anywhere. She had seen it, once, in this very house, in the keeping of the man I had married. She had recognized the child's stitching because she had helped teach us it, long ago, and she had never forgotten. She had taken the chance, some weeks back, of asking Amos for it, and to her surprise he had given it up, this half, and kept the other. My sister's half of our childhood sampler had been in Amos's hands before I ever came to his house, before, Sabina thought, he had ever laid eyes on me. I sat there with the cloth in my palm and felt the ground shift under everything I had believed. I had told myself Amos was a stranger who had been fed a story about my family, a man enforcing rules he did not fully understand. But a stranger does not hold half of a torn sampler that two little girls made and split between them. That was not a rule handed down to him. That was a thing given, deliberately, from someone to someone. Anneke had kept her half all her life, as I had kept mine in my chest of quilts. Now hers was here, in the house of the man I married, and mine was upstairs in a drawer, and neither of us had put them together. Sabina gathered the last shells into the bucket and stood, her knees cracking like the walnuts. Before she left, she said one more thing, plainly, without looking at me. She said that if I wanted to understand my marriage, I should stop asking why they gave me to Amos and start asking why Amos had ever wanted anything to do with Anneke in the first place. Then she went down the lane in the failing light, and I sat on the step until it was full dark, holding a scrap of cloth that had traveled a road I could not yet trace, and knowing that the story I lived inside was older and stranger than I had let myself believe. I did not sleep that night, and in the morning I did the thing I had circled for weeks. Amos was out repairing fence at the far field and would not be back before noon. Barbara had gone with Fanny to a quilting the next district over. The house was mine and empty for once, and the writing box sat on its high shelf with its keyhole turned to the wall. I took it down. It was not even locked well. The little latch gave to a hairpin in a moment, which told me the box was less a vault than a signal, a way of saying stay out, that everyone had agreed to honor. I had stopped agreeing. Inside were letters, not many, and old, the paper soft with handling. They were in my sister's hand, the same loose, eager writing I had grown up reading over her shoulder, and they were addressed to Amos, from before my wedding, from a time when I had been told the two had never met. I read them standing at the window with my heart going hard and slow. They were not love letters, not quite, but they were the letters of two young people who knew each other well and trusted each other, and who were frightened of the same thing. Amos and my sister had been close, once, in a way no one had ever let me suspect. The letters did not tell the whole story, but they told me the shape of it, and the shape rearranged everything. In one, Annika wrote that she could not go on pretending she had not seen what she saw, and that she would not marry into a family that expected her to. In another, she wrote to Amos as the only person she trusted with the truth, and thanked him for keeping her half of the sampler safe, so that if anything happened to her, someone would know she had been real and had not simply gone quietly mad the way they would say she had. That line took the breath out of me, so that someone would know she had been real. I understood, all at once, what the first question had meant. That first night, in the cold kitchen, when Amos asked where they had sent Anarchy, I had heard a stranger's odd interest in a woman who was not his wife. I had even, in my worst private moments, wondered if he had wanted her instead of me. That was not it at all. He had been asking whether she was safe. He had been asking whether she still had a place in the world, and whether she knew that he had not been able to stop what was done to her. His first words in our marriage were not a betrayal of me. They were the only loyalty he had left to give her. And then the harder truth came up under that one. If Amos had loved and trusted my sister, and if she had refused a match and been sent away for what she had seen, then my marriage was not separate from her exile. It was the other half of it. The two fathers had a problem in Annika, a daughter who would not keep quiet, and they had solved it two ways at once. They removed her, and they gave Amos a wife, and the wife they chose was the sister least likely to make trouble. I had not been married to Amos to make him happy. I had been married to him to fill the space Anneki left, and to bind him to the family whose secret she threatened, and to be a proof to everyone that the matter was closed. Barbara had known. My father had known, badly enough to let one slip in that closed room. Enos had known. And Amos had known most of all, and had gone through with it, and had kept my sister's half of the sampler in a box on a high shelf, like a man tending a grave he was not allowed to visit. I sat down on the floor with the letters in my lap. I was not angry at him, not the way you would expect. I was grieving. Grieving that my husband's deepest tenderness had been spent before I ever arrived, on a woman 2 valleys away, and that I had married a man whose heart was already a locked box turned to the wall. The third plate made sense now, and the sense of it was almost unbearable. It was not for a guest. It had been Annike's, in some earlier plan that never came to be, in a version of this house where she was the one who sat at that table. Amos had kept setting it out of a habit no grief had let him break, and I had spent my married life eating across from an empty chair that had been meant for my own sister. The house had been telling me the truth every single evening. I simply had not known the language until now. I put the letters back exactly as I had found them, and the sampler half with them, and I turned the box's keyhole to the wall again, because I was not ready for anyone to know I knew. But something in me had turned along with it. I was no longer a girl trying to settle into a marriage. I was a woman holding a secret that belonged to 3 families and to a sister I had been forbidden to reach. And I understood, coldly and clearly, that if this arrangement had been built to keep Annika silent forever, then I was now the one person inside it who could break it. The only question left was what that would cost, and I was about to learn that it would cost nearly everything. Knowing did not free me. That is the part no one tells you. I had the truth in my hands, and I could do almost nothing with it, and the distance between knowing and acting became its own kind of prison. It was deep winter by then. The roads between the valleys were rutted ice. I had no money that was mine, no way to travel that did not pass through a man who answered to Enos or my father, and no address for Aneke beyond a vague north that could have been 100 farms. If I moved too soon, I would only prove them right that I was the second daughter who could not settle, and they would close the last gaps I had left to work in. So I did what my mother's people had always done. I became smaller and quieter than I had ever been, and I used the smallness. I performed contentment so well that even Barbara relaxed. I asked no more questions about Aneke. I set the fourth plate for Barbara without comment, and did not so much as glance at the third. I let them believe the family council had done its work, and that I had been settled like a horse that had finally stopped fighting the harness. And all the while, underneath, I was watching the mail again, this time not for my own letters, but for anything that might carry the North in it, any return address, any name. The chance came in a thaw in late February. A letter arrived for Barbara from a relative up north, and she read it at the window and set it on the table while she went to tend something on the stove. I had perhaps a minute. I did not take the letter. Taking it would have been noticed. Instead, I read the return corner and held the name and the town in my mind, the way you hold a coal you must not drop, and I carried it upstairs and wrote it small inside the hem of an apron where no one would think to look. It was not Aneki's address, but it was someone near her, someone who could reach her, and after months of nothing it felt like touching her hand. Amos and I, in those months, lived like two people guarding opposite doors of the same house. He did not know I had opened the box. I did not tell him I knew about the letters, or the sampler, or what his first question had meant. We were kind to each other in the small ways that cost nothing and mean nothing, passing the salt, minding the fire, and we were strangers in every way that mattered. I grieved for the marriage I had briefly, foolishly hoped mine might become. Back in those first weeks when I mistook his gentleness for a beginning. It had never been a beginning. It had been a man being decent to the woman he had been given in place of the one he lost. I paid for the silence in ways that were hard to name. I stopped saying what I thought, then stopped thinking it clearly, then found whole days going by in which I was only a set of hands doing the work of the house. The girl who had loved her difficult bright sister, who had once had opinions about small things, grew faint inside me. That is the true cost of being made useful. Not that they work you, that you begin to agree with their measure of you, and mistake your own disappearing for peace. There were mornings I looked at the plain window and could not have told you a single thing I wanted, and did not find that strange. There was one moment of real hope, and it came from Amos, and it broke my heart precisely because it was genuine. One night in early spring, after Barbara had at last gone home, he sat late by the stove and said, without my asking, that he was sorry for how our marriage had begun. He said he had not chosen the way of it, that things had been decided for him too, and that I deserved better than a house full of shut doors. It was the most he had ever given me. For a moment I thought I might tell him everything, that we might become, at last, two people on the same side of the wall. Then I asked him, gently, whether he would help me reach Aneke. Just a letter, just to know she was well. And I watched the door close in him again, the old fence going up behind his eyes. He said he could not, that it was not safe for her, that some things had to stay as they were. He believed it. That was the worst of it. He had decided that silence protected her, and he clung to that belief because it let him do nothing and call it love. His sorrow was real, and his help was impossible, and I understood that his tenderness and his cowardice lived in the same man and could not be separated. That was the night my last hope in him died and something harder took its place. I had been waiting, I realized, for someone with more power than me to set things right, for Amos or my father or even Barbara to relent and open the door. No one was going to. The silence protected everyone in that house, and everyone in that house had agreed to be protected. Only Aneke and I paid for it, and only I was still close enough to the door to reach the latch. I lay awake with the apron and its hidden hem beside the bed, and I stopped asking whether I was allowed to act. I began instead to plan how. The thing that made waiting impossible arrived in April, carried in Barbara's own careful voice. She mentioned, over the supper she had come back to oversee, that arrangements were being discussed for Aneke up north. A steady widower, she said, with land and children who needed a mother. A good match, she said, using the exact words that had been used about mine. My sister, who had refused a marriage and been exiled for what she saw, was to be married off after all, in a place with no one to help her, to a stranger chosen to fold her back into the family's peace. What had been done to me was about to be done to her, and this time there would be no watching second daughter to find the letters. I understood in that moment that neutrality was no longer possible. As long as I did nothing, I was not merely a victim of the arrangement. I was part of it. My quiet contentment, my performed settling, my set plates and averted eyes, all of it helped prove that the family's method worked and could be worked again. If I stayed silent while they married Annika off, I would be the proof that a difficult daughter could be managed and a compliant one installed in her place. I would be teaching them that it was safe to do it once more. I could not carry that. I would rather carry anything else. The choice in front of me was plain and terrible. I could warn Annika, using the name and town hidden in my apron hem, and tell her what I knew, and break open the thing our whole marriage had been built to keep closed. Or I could stay, and keep my roof and my place and the family's grudging protection, and let my sister vanish into a second silence. There was no version where I kept both. To reach for her was to let go of everything that made me safe, and I had spent my whole life being the daughter who chose safety. This was the first time safety and I were going to have to part. Barbara, sensing something, pressed harder in the following days. She reminded me, not unkindly, of what a family had suffered with one wayward daughter, and how a wise wife did not reopen wounds that had finally begun to heal. My father sent word through her that he hoped I had settled and would soon give the family good news, meaning a child, meaning a rooting that would bind me past any thought of leaving. They were offering me a fresh start, they said, a clean page, if only I would forget the North entirely. The pressure was gentle and constant, like water, and I had seen what water does to stone. The help I did not expect came, in the end, from Amos, though he never spoke of it, and I never thanked him aloud. One evening he took the writing box down himself, in front of me, and made a show of checking that its latch was fastened. Then he set it back and left the house to see to the horses, and when I went to it, the latch was not fastened at all. He had left it open. He could not bring himself to hand me the letters, or to say, "Do this." But he could turn his back and leave the door ajar, and let me be the one who walked through it, so that whatever came after would be my doing and not his. It was the most honest thing he ever gave me. They tried once more to hold the old order. Barbara found me, the day before I meant to act, and put into my hands a letter already written, addressed to the relatives up north, in her own tidy script. It was a letter I was to copy in my own hand and send, expressing my joy at Annike's coming marriage and my hope that she would be happy. My blessing on the very thing being done to her. It was clever. My words, my hand, my apparent consent, sent north to tell my sister that even I agreed she should submit. I took the letter and said I would copy it that night, and Barbara was satisfied, and went to bed believing the last door closed. I did copy a letter that night, at the kitchen table, by the same low lamp that had lit my wedding evening, but I did not copy hers. I wrote my own, in my own hand, and I told Annika everything. I told her I had found her letters, and her half of our sampler in Amos's box. I told her I knew she had seen something and refused to keep it, and that I honored her for it. I told her a second match was being arranged to finish silencing her, and that she did not have to accept it, and that whatever it cost me, she was not alone and never had been. Then I sealed it with the hidden name from my apron hem, and, before dawn, I gave it not to Amos and not to Barbara, but to old Sabina at the end of the lane, who took it without a word and tucked it into her own coat. Weeks passed with nothing, the longest weeks of my life, and I moved through the house braced every morning for the moment they would discover what I had done. Then a reply came, but not through the family's hands. Sabina brought it to me at the fence in the gray of an early morning, and it was Annika's writing, and it was short. She had gotten my letter. She had refused the widower. She was not coming quietly this time, and she was no longer afraid, because for the first time in years she knew that someone on the inside had seen the truth and chosen her over the family's peace. I held that page against the cold fence rail and felt the whole careful arrangement crack straight down its middle, along the same seam our sampler had been cut, and I knew there was no closing it again. The families moved quickly once they understood, but they moved into a truth that would no longer hold still. When Annika refused the match and named, in her own letters home, the thing she had seen years before, there was no counsel quiet enough to contain it. I learned the whole of it at last, in pieces, from Sabina and from Annika's own hand once we were finally writing freely. Years before my marriage, Annika had discovered a dishonesty between the two fathers, a matter of money and property misrepresented in a land dealing, a lie that would have shamed both families and cost them standing in the district. She had refused to pretend she had not seen it, and a daughter who will not pretend is, to families like ours, a danger that must be moved. So they had moved her, and to bind the wound she left, they had arranged my marriage to Amos, the young man who had loved her and knew what she knew, choosing me because I was the daughter thought least likely to ask questions. That was the full answer to the question I had carried since my wedding night. When Amos asked, in that cold kitchen where they had sent Anneka, he was not asking out of suspicion and not out of longing for a woman denied him. He was asking whether the person who had told the truth was still safe, and whether she knew he had not been able to save her. His first words to me were the only unbroken loyalty in a house built entirely of broken ones. Who knew what? I finally understood completely. Both fathers had known everything, for they had made it. Barbara had known and had appointed herself the keeper of the silence, reading my letters and setting the family's face. Amos had known and had used his low final voice to end any conversation that neared it. Amos had known most painfully of all, and had chosen to obey and grieve rather than resist. Only Anneke and I had been kept apart and kept ignorant. Each told a version that made the other seem lost. The whole design depended on the two of us never comparing our halves of the story. The sampler, torn down the middle, had been the truest picture of it all along. The cost to me was real, and I will not pretend it away. My marriage did not become a warm thing after the truth came out. It became an honest thing, which is different and sometimes harder. My father's favor, and the small securities that came with being a family's reliable daughter, were gone. I was, in the family's eyes, the second daughter who had turned out like the first after all, and there were doors in that district that never opened warmly to me again. I had traded belonging for truth, and I felt the weight of the trade on ordinary mornings for years, in the coolness of relatives and the careful distance of neighbors who had once called me fortunate. For the others, justice was uneven and incomplete, the way it usually is. The father's old dishonesty became known enough to dent their standing, but not enough to undo them. Men of property have a way of surviving their own exposure. Barbara never once admitted her part. To her dying day, she spoke of that time as a season of my restlessness, my difficulty, as though the reading of my letters had been a kindness I had failed to appreciate. There was no grand reckoning, no public confession in a Sunday meeting, no moment where the whole district gasped and set things right. The people who built the silence mostly kept their comfort. I have made my peace with that, though it took a long time. But the thing they had built their whole arrangement to prevent did happen. Annika and I were no longer kept apart. Her refusal of the second match held, because this time she was not alone in the dark, with only the family's word for what was real. She came south, eventually, not to that house but to a district of her own choosing, and the first time I saw her, after all those years, we did not speak for a long moment, only looked. She had brought her half of the sampler. I had kept mine, buried in my chest of quilts through all of it. That afternoon we laid the two halves together on a table, the torn seams meeting, the child's cross-stitching lining up as though it had only ever waited to be whole. I think often now about that cold first evening and how completely I misread it. I had sat across from a stranger at a table set for three and heard his question about my sister as the thing that made me least important in my own marriage. In truth, it was the one honest word spoken to me under that roof. Everyone else that night, and for months after, told me smooth and comfortable lies. Amos alone told me a true thing, even if he could not tell me it was true. His question was not a wound. It was a hand held out in the dark to a woman he could not name yet, hoping she might one day understand what he was really asking. And I did, in the end. I understand now that the arrangement chose me because I was thought to be manageable, the safe daughter, the one who would settle and set the plates and never trip the alarm. That judgment was almost right. It was only wrong in one place. They did not account for the fact that the same quietness that made me seem safe also made me invisible, and that an invisible woman can read letters, hold names in her memory, hide an address in a hem, and pass a truth down a lane in another woman's coat. The very thing that made me useful to them was the thing that let me undo them. They handed me a roll, and I used it to reach my sister. That is the whole of what I did, and I have never once been sorry. Continue Part 11. Annika and I are old women now, or near enough, and we live within an afternoon's drive of each other, which after everything still feels like a small miracle. I stayed married to Amos until his death some years ago. Ours was never the marriage the neighbors imagined on our wedding day, but it became, in time, something quieter and more real than a lie would have allowed. He never learned to speak the truth easily, but he stopped standing against the door, and in his last years he set the third plate himself, on the evenings Annika visited, and no one had to explain to me any more who it was for. What I reclaimed was not grand. I did not overturn a community, or win a public apology, or become anything the world would notice. I reclaimed the simple right to be a person rather than a repair, a woman with a sister she was allowed to love out loud. For years I had let the family's measure of me become my own, until I could stand at a window and not name a single thing I wanted. Getting that back, the plain ability to want and to choose, was the whole of my victory. It does not sound like much. It was everything I had been quietly told I would never be permitted to have. Some things stayed broken, and I have stopped needing them to be otherwise. The older generation went to their graves with their silence intact. Not one of them ever sat with me and named plainly what had been done. The dishonesty that started it all was never openly answered. I made peace, not with the people, but with the fact that I would not receive from them the acknowledgement I was owed, and that my healing could not wait on their confession. That, too, is a kind of freedom, though a colder one. You learn to close a wound the other person refuses to admit they made. I keep the sampler now, the whole of it, the two halves stitched back together along the seam where they were once cut. The join is not invisible. You can see, if you look, the place where it was torn and mended, a slight pucker in the cloth, the old threads not quite matching the new. I like that you can see it. A thing that has been broken and made whole again is not the same as a thing that was never broken, and it should not pretend to be. It hangs in my front room, and now and then a young person asks about it, and I tell them only that my sister and I made it as girls and were apart for a long time. The rest they do not need. But I know what the seam means. If there is a wider truth in this, it is a careful one, and I will not stretch it further than it goes. This was one family, in one valley, making one arrangement, and dressing it in the ordinary clothes of our life, so it would pass unquestioned. I will not tell you that this is how the Amish marry, or how any whole people live, because it is not, and the worst harm of a story like mine would be to let it become a stone thrown at everyone who lives plainly. What I will say is smaller, and I think truer. Wherever people love order more than they love each other, someone gets chosen to hold the silence together, and it is usually the one thought least likely to complain. You may have grown up nothing like me. Your rooms and your rules and your reasons may look entirely different from a cold farmhouse 2 valleys from anywhere. But some of you will know, in your own settings, the particular ache of being valued for what you could smooth over rather than for who you were, of being called the easy one, the reliable one, the one who would never make trouble, and slowly understanding that the praise was a job description. If that ache is familiar, then you already understand the most important thing in this story, and you did not need me to travel to a farmhouse to teach it to you. So the question I want to leave with you is not whether you have suffered, and I would never ask you to lay something painful out in a comment for strangers. I want to ask something gentler. When did you first realize that you had been chosen for what you could do, rather than for who you were? And what did you do with that knowledge once you had it? If you feel like telling me, I read what you write, and I am grateful for it. And if these quiet, hidden stories are ones you want to keep hearing, staying with this channel is how you make sure the next one reaches you. I have thought a great deal about the word Amos said first, that cold night, and how long it took me to hear it right. I spent months believing my marriage began with a question that pushed me aside, a question about someone who was not me. I understand now that it was the opposite. A marriage that begins with a lie has nowhere honest to grow. Mine began with the one man in that house asking, in the only way he could, whether the truth was still alive somewhere. It took me years to answer him fully. The answer was yes. The truth was still alive, 2 valleys north, keeping her half of a torn cloth, waiting for someone quiet enough to reach her.